Hello, this video is all about my string quartet number 20. This is the first of a series of quartets that I wrote in a 12/8 time signature. And the idea of this was to explore and exploit the different possibilities within the compound time. So although there's a feeling of 4, you also have the 3 from each individual beat. So there are various ways that you can treat this, and I wanted to play around with it. As with a lot of my other pieces, this one is built over a repeating pattern, a sort of ostinato. And at the start we hear just the bass notes of this ostinato, layered over each other in the different parts. And then subsequently everything is built on these notes. So the quaver figure that's set up by the cello after A is a harmonised, decorated form of that sequence. The harmonic progression itself actually owes something to Dvorak. It comes a little bit from a sequence in the third movement of his violin concerto, although it doesn't resolve in quite the same way, and it's fairly hard to recognise now, but it is there. This 8-bar ostinato starts in G minor, but the last bar sounds as though it's going to take us into C minor. The first chord is actually the diminished chord on the 7th of the scale, the B natural, in C minor. So it sounds as though it's going to resolve onto the dominant 7th on the G, and then go into C. But at the last second, in the last half of the final bar, it switches direction to keep us in G minor. And that's important because the next time it comes round, it does something different. So we stay in G minor for another 8 bars, from B to C, with the texture slowly building. Each part is playing something very distinct. But in the bar before C, rather than switching direction to keep us in G minor, as it did before, the cello line does indeed give us the dominant 7th on the G. So we modulate. But we don't quite go where you'd expect. So instead of going into C minor, we end up in B minor, which is a bit of a surprise. The parts swap around a bit and things start to build up a bit more, and then at D we hear something approaching a melody for the first time, still in B minor. This builds up to E when we get a real statement of the melody. This is really where we've been heading. And again, as we approach F, the ostinato figure, which is now in the second violin, doesn't turn back towards the key we're in, the B minor, but instead we get a dominant 7th, which should take us into E minor. But as before, it doesn't go where we'd expect, and it actually takes us back to G minor where we started. And things go quiet again. The texture changes. The ostinato is now inverted in the first violin, while the second violin is also playing continuous quavers, but these are very staccato, so there's a contrast between the two. Meanwhile, the cello introduces a counter melody against the original melody in the viola. So this section is a bit of a transition. There are some new things going on. And it all builds up again as we get towards G, where the key changes again back into B minor. And we get a combination of these ideas. The inverted ostinato is now played against the original version of the ostinato in the 2 violins. And while the cello takes over the staccato quavers that were previously in the second violin, giving this sort of choppiness in the bass, the viola now plays the counter melody, but there's no melody anymore. So although we've landed somewhere, it's not a particularly comfortable landing. It doesn't really feel as though we've arrived exactly, although we've certainly got somewhere. And it never really does arrive, because at H, although we change key again to E flat minor, everything starts to wind down. The texture thins out a bit, and we only get fragments of the ostinato exchange between the second violin and viola. At I, we return home to G minor, but everything is ever more fragmentary, and the first violin and cello play the counter melody and the canon. and a third apart, which is reminiscent of what we heard right at the beginning. Eventually, the other parts join them, and we end up back where we started.